This video is a little different than my usual adventures. In it, I show how I look after my 15-year-old Mariner 25 horsepower two-stroke. A boat outboard has to be reliable, as a breakdown at sea may require assistance from others, or worse, it may be life-threatening. As such, I like to know my outboard inside out, and I do all my own servicing. Disclaimer: although I was a trained engineer by trade, I am not an engine mechanic, and I don't pretend to be. This video is for interest only, and is how I have successfully maintained my own outboard over many miles at sea and many years. I may not follow correct procedures, so take it with a pinch of salt if you wish. If you have followed some of my adventures, I am sure you will agree the outboard always runs as sweet as a nut, and it has never let me down, so I must do something right. After every use at sea is flushed out in a bucket of water to clear salt deposits from internal passages. After 15 years of good use, it still pumps water like a train. On the last flush of the season, before storing it for winter, I add a bottle of vinegar to the water in the bucket. Run it for 5 minutes, run it another 5 minutes in clean water to flush out the vinegar solution. The vinegar is also great for removing white curd marks of the salt from paint in the leg. Although the outboard started easily when warm and ran perfectly, the past few outings took more pulls to cold start with the choke out, which indicated something was not quite right. On investigation, I discovered petrol splattering out a small hole when it was running in choke. Although I'm not a motor mechanic, I know fuel splattering onto a hot engine is not healthy, so I took the outboard out to service and gave it a complete service overhaul. I sent an order to Pacer Marine for the parts I required, and they were delivered the next day. They include 2 new spark plugs, a water pump impeller, gear case oil screw gaskets, and because the starter rope was 15 years old and fraying, a new starter rope, and also a complete carburetor rebuild kit. I serviced the cooling system first, which includes the water pump and the thermostat. The water pump is in the lower unit and secured to the top of the gearbox, as shown by the arrow. To get access to the pump, the 4 bolts just below the anti-splash plate need removed. However, before removing the 4 bolts, I have to disconnect the gearshift rod. It is done by removing a gearshift linkage which is just below the carburetor as shown. With the gearshift linkage removed, I can then release the 4 bolts and the gearbox will come off. Be sure to support the gearbox as it's quite heavy, and if it drops under its own weight could damage something. I always loosen the 4 bolts first before taking any out. That way I know they're all free and one won't jam. Because I take the gearbox off every year, it comes off quite easily, but if it's not been off for a while, it can corrode on and be a bit of a problem. And I now have access to the water pump housing. The 3 rods, starting from the propeller end, are a water cooler pipe, the main drive shaft, and then the gear shift lever. Here you can see the hole in the gear shift lever, which the linkage that I removed earlier fits into, and allows the gears to be engaged or disengaged from the tiller handle. It's also very important that there is a washer located at this position. It often comes off when removing a gearbox, as happened this time. I found it in the leg as shown. If you lose it or don't fit it, you can't select reverse gear, so make sure it's in place when assembling again. Before assembly, I also like to cover the main drive shaft splines with a coating of grease. This stops it corroding into the power head, which as mentioned earlier can make removal difficult. I should perhaps also mention that any bolts that I remove have a thin coating of marine grease put in the threads to stop them corroding in place. Rightly or wrongly, I just used trailer wheel bearing grease and had no issues and no bolts working loose. I then held the gearbox keg in a vise in my shed and undid the 4 bolts that hold the water pump housing in place. Once the rubber ring on the drive shaft is removed, the housing then slides unresisted upwards. The impeller will then be found either on the water pump plate or in the water pump housing. Although I religiously check the impeller every season, I only change it every 3 years if it is still in good condition, example, not excessively worn, or the fins bent and no sign of the material cracking. This impeller is now 3 years old and still looks okay, but I will replace it regardless after this period of time. Note that the small key in the drive shaft is now only sat in place, so don't lose it. It must be kept and then located in the new impeller, as this is what turns it. There are also 2 thin plastic washers to watch out for and not lose. They sit either side of the impeller and one can be seen sitting on the water pump plate. So make sure they are still there when the new impeller is installed. After cleaning the housing's black rubber gasket, I then coat everything with the waterproof grease, just to ensure everything runs smoothly. The new impeller also gets a thin coating of grease, as does the water pump plate. I have heard some greases soften the impeller, but as I keep mine for 3 years and never had any problems, I don't think the trailer grease affects it that much. But as mentioned, I'm no expert, so use whichever grease you're comfortable with. The new impeller is then put on the drive shaft, making sure the small key slots into the impeller and that the impeller can no longer rotate freely around the drive shaft. The housing cover is then put back in place. It's extremely important the impeller fins are bent in the correct direction. It can be a fiddly job, but I find the best way is to rotate the drive shaft in a clockwise direction while feeding in the fins with a free finger. Then it's simply a case of bolting it back in place and tightening the bolts in a diagonally opposite sequence. Oh, and don't forget to replace the little rubber ring on the drive shaft. Now is the interesting part, reinstalling the gearbox, ensuring the gear shift lever, the drive shaft and the water pipe all mate up inside the leg. In this instance, I earlier removed the leg from the power head to clean out the old exhaust carbons, and when I put it back, I attached the water pipe to the power head. I'm mentioning this in case you wonder what happened to the water pipe. I just didn't video that part. If it's not sliding home as shown in this video, it's most likely that the gear shift lever is not going into the linkage below the carburetor. And I did remember the washer I mentioned earlier. Either that or the drive shaft splines are binding into the power head unit. This can be rectified by pulling the starter cord slightly to rotate the power head. Now that everything was aligned and the gearbox in position on the leg, I insert the bolts and hand tighten them, leaving a bit of play so I can ensure the gear shift lever is properly in the gear shift linkage. Once I'm happy it is, the link pin is reinserted and I tighten up the 4 bolts holding the gearbox in place. And that's that part of the job done. Before running the outboard in water to check my work, I took a look at the thermostat, which is housed in a cover on the top cylinder's jacket. When I first checked it around 6 years ago, the cover bolts had seized solid and broke off. I had to drill them out, then re-tap new threads before using new bolts. That's why I like to loosen any bolts I see, grease the threads and retighten. It saves a lot of bother later on if they seize. Technically, I should renew the cover gasket, but I made a replacement from an old PVC patch, so now just clean it and apply a little grease to the surface and it's never leaked. It's only a low pressure water seal, so good enough for me. When I first checked the thermostat the time the bolts burst, it was pretty corroded and a fair bit of salt was seen around its housing. I guess the previous owner didn't flush out board as religiously as I do. This thermostat is still in good condition after 6 years and not the sign of salt anywhere. I put it back in, happily knowing that everything was now okay with the cooling system. It was now time to check it all still worked as it should. The excess smoke is because I was starting it with full choke and running in a slightly oilier fuel mix than usual. Note that the water only dribbles out when started from cold. That is because the cooling water is not warm enough to operate the thermostat, which allows the water to flow properly. Once the cooling water reaches bath water temperature, the thermostat operates and it pumps plenty water, which proves my thermostat and water pump are working fine. I now turn my attention to the propeller. On this outboard, it's only held on by one large nylon-type material nut. There is no castellated washers or split pins, which has always surprised me, but I have checked, and in this model it is definitely only the big nut that holds it in place. I remove the prop once a year, clean and re-grease the splines to ensure it doesn't corrode in place, and also check there's nothing like old discarded fishing gut wound round the prop shaft. Reassemble, taking great care not to strip the threads in the nylon nut, and another job's done. Next up is the gearbox oil change, which involves taking out 2 screws, one at the bottom of the gearbox and one at the top. Collect the oil in a suitable container. Put new washers on the gearbox screws, then fill the gearbox with new oil by using the bottom screw hole. I use the toothpaste type tubes of oil, as the end fits in the hole as I squeeze in the oil. Fill until the oil starts coming out the top hole. If it's very cold when I'm doing this job, I often heat the oil up so it's easy to squeeze in. I do this by leaving the tube of oil in a sink of hot water for a while. Once the oil starts coming out the top hole, I insert the top screw and tighten it up while preventing the oil running back out the bottom hole by keeping the empty tube jammed in it. Once the top hole is sealed, it's easy to close the bottom hole, then tighten the screws and another part of the service is done. I now turn my attention to the carburetor issue, but first I have to remove the flywheel cover which also holds the starter rope, which I wanted to renew. 3 bolts hold the cover in place, and the fuel filter is also attached to the cover. I removed the filter and cleaned it while I was there. Great care has to be taken when renewing the starter rope, as it is rewound by a very powerful spring. I find the best way to do is to pull the rope fully out, then jam the mechanism with something like a screwdriver, always keeping in mind that if it slips it could cause an injury. Once the old rope is out, I tie a thumb knot in the new rope and melt the knot into a solid blob so it can't come undone. It's then cut to the same length as the old rope and threaded into the unit. The pull handle is then attached with another thumb knot melted into a blob. Another job done. I now turn my attention to the carburetor issue. I'm not going into a step-by-step description of this one, as I'm aware the video is increasing in length and could be boring for those not interested in seeing how I service the outboard. It is quite fiddly, but straightforward enough removing the carburetor and the choke operating mechanism. The carburetor can be thought of as having three separate parts: the priming unit or choke, the main carburetor body, and the fuel pump. I use carb cleaner, and as any dirt at all can contaminate the small passageways and jets inside the carburetor, I thoroughly clean the outside before dismantling it. I also use a rocket air blower for cleaning cameras etc. to blow through the small jets. I was curious to find out why fuel was coming out the hole in the primer unit while running under choke, so examined it first. As soon as I saw the primer diaphragm I could see why. It was old and had cracks in it, and in some places small bits had even disintegrated. It was replaced, and I renewed all other parts in the primer unit that came with the rebuild kit. The main body was also dismantled and thoroughly cleaned, with all the gaskets and other parts in the rebuild kit being used. I checked the float height before assembling it all again. There is obviously a lot more to it than shown here, but it gives you the basics. Just remember where everything came from and remember to use all the parts again. The needle valve left in the paper was the old one, just in case you're wondering. I confess that I sometimes thought of the fuel pump diaphragm as I started out on a 10-mile open sea crossing etc. I knew, like the primer diaphragm, it was ageing, so was happy to buy the full rebuild kit, which includes a new fuel pump diaphragm and gaskets. It was actually okay, which is not surprising as the outboard always ran well. But now the fuel pump has been cleaned and rebuilt with new parts, I can forget about it too. While the carburetor was out, I had a good clean of the power head tray, and also checked the kill cord switch. A quick look inside the cylinder head intake, and I saw the reed valves were in great condition with no corrosion. So I'm very happy I'll get a few more miles out of this old engine yet. In fact, it's in great condition for its age. With the carburetor now back in place, I went round and greased all moving parts. Checked the sacrificial anode, which had plenty of life left yet. Celebrated its 15-year service with a new set of spark plugs which I'd set to the correct gap. After all, the old ones had lasted me 2.5 years. Then put it back in a bucket of water to test my work. It took 2 pulls from cold start, and there was no petrol splittering out little holes in the carburetor, so I was delighted. You now know it only dribbles water until the thermostat operates, which proves it was a cold start. I always have the cover on when I start it for safety reasons. I then had a quick play with the mixture screw, turning it first lean, then a little rich, then decided to leave it where it was, as that seemed to the best position. Happy everything was working the way it should, and because I was now storing it through winter, I let it run until the carburetor was almost empty, then squirted fogging oil into the carburetor's opening. I then removed the spark plugs again and squirted more fogging oil into the barrels, then manually turned the engine over to lubricate it, and that was my job done. The outboard is ready for next year. I hope you found the video interesting. Thanks for watching.